I think that all of us here can identify at different times in life where new information has changed the way we think about the past, whether these are experiences or things that cause us to reflect on family history, or even how we understand our own common cultural past that we all share. Now, how many of us have trolled on Google to a site like 23andme.com or ancestry.ca? How many people have done this? Okay. How many people like me are only curious enough until the free trial ends? Yes? Okay. It's funny how my curiosity is killed when a monthly subscription applies. Then I know enough and I'm fine. But if you follow the news on these sites, you'll know that they're celebrated as well as debated for how these archives and the technology behind them can provide fresh insights, as well as open up new perspectives or at times even difficult questions on who we are or where we came from. Now, I think this interest, this wider interest in digging into the past to uncover something new from something that's either very old, like an archive, or something that's only recently accessible, like DNA, for example, this really dovetails with something that we see in ancient studies and medieval studies that focuses on different manuscript cultures. And I want to share a few stories with you. There are two recent projects that I think the Google algorithm that clocks on my phone must have some very peculiar ideas of what I'm interested in, but this was front and center a couple of years ago. The top of my news feed said this: jetpacks discovered in medieval manuscript. That caught my attention. I clicked on the story, and as I read further, I was somewhat let down to find that, unfortunately, no, jetpacks weren't discovered in the 16th century. What this is from was a 16th century German theoretical military manual where the writers of this text were starting to wonder how could they do damage on the enemy by strapping primitive bombs to cats and then letting them loose. Now, I am not a cat person, but I will say I disagree with this practice. Not on an ethical level, but on a logistical level. If you have a cat in the room tonight, where does it always return at the end of the day? Home. Kaboom, right? Suddenly the cat has exploded, so have you, and the enemy has won the war without even knowing you were trying to attack them. So not only is this a terrible idea for many reasons, it just gives us some insight into some of the theories in the past about how you could do damage in some terribly brutal and crazy ways. This one, however, was even more interesting to me. This is from a team at the British Library. Credit to their research department finding out how to popularize their findings. This news article promised that Star Wars characters have been found in medieval manuscripts. Again, that just lit up my entire world all of a sudden for about 30 seconds. But once again, my hopes were dashed. As I read through the article, I found that Yoda and Leia and Chewbacca, who are in other images I don't have here, were not in fact discovered centuries before George Lucas dreamed them up. What these images are in fact monastic self-understandings, depictions of monks, saints, royals, and the like, that give us a different sort of perspective on how these people viewed themselves and viewed others. So is it intergalactic? Well, hardly, but I think it's insightful nonetheless. Now, I wish I could say that the goal of this Canada Research Chair that we're launching was to discover rocket cats or to finally identify the root of the Rebel Alliance in antiquity. But if I did that, I think that I'd be getting a phone call in the morning from Dr. Stringham asking me what I'm doing. So that is not our goal. But what interests me about these stories and these projects is at the core of our research program and some of my interests share a common focus on how new information from overlooked or forgotten texts can shed light on uncharted worlds or things that we didn't know existed, the way people thought, lived, or perceived of themselves, their identities. So if we go from rocket cats to Yoda, maybe we can start making our way closer to the subject of our talk tonight. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we saw a series of manuscript discoveries, I have a few of them here, that now scholars are just finally starting to sort and sift and discuss openly. These included a number of finds. I have 3 of them for us here. On the bottom left, we have some materials from what's called the Cairo Geniza, offered up a number of very important Jewish texts. They were discovered, again, quite late. At a place called Oxyrhynchus, one of the best places to find new texts is in garbage dumps in the ancient world. Some very important papyri were found here. Of course, we also have what are quite often called the Nag Hammadi texts, again, another Egyptian location where codices of early Christian variety were found. For many scholars, this is really our ancestry.ca. This is where we go to find out what is it that we haven't seen or what is it we need to know about the past. Now, I want to say a brief word about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I'd rather show you that world and let you touch some of that world. So I'll give a bit of an intro, and this is an aerial drone flyover of the landscape of Qumran and the place where we found the scrolls. And one of our research assistants tonight will be just passing around a few scroll facsimile fragments from the Israel Antiquities Authority that you can have a look at. Some of these texts you're seeing and holding are actually the texts we're working on in grad theses and research projects. Now, the scrolls that we have here before us, just some examples, these were found in 11 caves dotting the region near the northwest shores of the Dead Sea. These are found by an ancient archaeological site known as Qumran. Here is one of the caves, and you'll see the site in a moment. Now, this site was home to an ancient Jewish scribal community. They lived there from around about 150 or 100 BCE to 68 CE. Now, why such an exact date? Why 68 CE? Well, tragically, this group was swept off the map by the Romans, who were in hot pursuit of a group of Jewish rebels that had been causing a disturbance in Jerusalem, and eventually were held up in Masada, the fortress just down the shores from the Dead Sea. Now, this destruction eventually, by accident, turned the community's library of texts that was tucked away in caves into a time capsule that laid undiscovered until 1947, so 71 years ago. Now, there are many types of literature in this collection. We have copies of biblical books, as well as writings that give insight into the worldview, structure, and practices of the community that lived and wrote and copied texts in this very settlement here. Now, what interests me most, however, are the writings in this collection that seem to have originated outside of this community, and the writings that are, in fact, beyond the Bible that many of us know and read today. Why? Well, I think these texts enable us to explore currents of thought, to refine our understanding of religious practice, and ultimately to articulate a new view of ancient Jewish identity in the period that was formative for biblical literature and then eventually foundational for Western culture. One key set of texts that fit this description are those that are written in Aramaic. Aramaic was a common language of the ancient Near East, and it was inherited by many ancient Jewish scribes through that experience of exile that we hear about in writings of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. Now, while my research team in the years ahead will chase these texts in a number of different directions with many, many different questions, I think we could say that all of those projects will relate to one single big picture question that kind of will be the umbrella for everything that we do. And it's simply this. How do the recently discovered Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls challenge, change, or confirm the way we think about the worlds before and beyond the Bible? These are untapped texts, new information. This is a fresh question, and we have the potential for brand new insights for something we haven't seen before. Now, I can't answer this question for you tonight, but I want to point ahead and say, here's some of the things we're thinking about as we work towards answers to this question. I want to give a sense of three things to kind of get at some of these big picture answers we're chasing down, and they relate to three different areas of research. The first pertains to canonical literature, and by that I mean writings that we find in the Jewish Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. How is it these new finds change what we think about them? The second has to do with how we reconstruct the conceptual world of ancient Judaism in this period. What were people thinking? What were they doing? And how were they living? And then finally, I want to end off by thinking about some of the broader cultural currency and impact that the Aramaic literature we have at Qumran has, even well beyond Jewish and Christian writings and ancient cultures. So we'll make our way through these in the next few minutes, but let's start with probably the most familiar and common territory for most of us here. Let's start in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament. Now, except for a few scattered words and phrases here and there in the Hebrew Bible, we have a few books, Ezra, Daniel, and a few lines that contain Aramaic in them. It's called the Hebrew Bible for a reason. It is written in what language? Hebrew. Okay, this feels like that was like asking a question the last week of class, not the first week of class. Yes, it's the Hebrew Bible, but we do have parts of it that were written in Aramaic. I think we could say, though, when we look at the very short list of passages, that ancient Judaism's Aramaic scribal heritage didn't really register much in the Hebrew Bible and eventually later on in the Old Testament. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries, again, just 70 years ago, seem to tell a different story. Between 10 to 15%, depending on how you count fragments of this puzzle, 10 to 15% of the Dead Sea Scrolls were in fact written in Aramaic, and most of these were writings we had no idea about until 70 years ago. So brand new text to us. In the period before the Hebrew Bible came to be, ancient Jewish scribes, such as these at Qumran, some of them perhaps, were in the business of both copying ancient texts and creating new ones in Aramaic, this language of empire. In some cases, such as for books like Ezra or Daniel, the manuscript evidence of this scribal activity in Aramaic is remarkable. The scrolls provide evidence of the text within a generation or two after some of these books were written. For the book of Daniel, for example, we're talking about 40 to 50 years after the book was written, we have material at Qumran for it. That is closer margin between composition and manuscript evidence that we have for any other biblical writing, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, or New Testament. So it's truly remarkable. But it's not only new texts that matter, it's also a fresh context for biblical literature that we can see is relevant for us here. So let's look at Daniel again. A lot of my research kind of points back to Daniel in some ways, so I want to show you one example of that. My colleagues here on campus that study the Greek scriptures, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, we call this the Septuagint, they know this well, and they would tell you that if you read the Greek version of Daniel, what we find are a series of other chapters and stories about Daniel, but he's cast in new adventures and some new exotic tales. Now, I have some favorites of this, and I just want to share two of them with you. Here's two scenes from manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, related to one of these stories called Bel and the Dragon. The first one here on the right is where Daniel defeats a dragon by feeding it a giant hairball made out of tar and pitch. This seems to me far more effective than a rocket cat and far more humane. The other image here is one I was also quite happy to find, and I'm glad to share with you tonight. Daniel, in one of these stories, finds himself back in the lion's den for misbehaving or something like this, and he gets hungry overnight. He prays to God, and God hears his prayers. And what does he do? God sends an angel to grab the prophet Habakkuk, literally by the hair of his head, to deliver a pot of stew. I think we've discovered the very earliest example of Uber Eats delivery. If the government of Canada is not sponsoring research in that, I don't know if we're doing the right thing. But all joking aside, these are important materials that don't quite register for many of us who are reading biblical literature related to the book of Daniel. So we already knew about those, but what else do we have when we dug up these scrolls at Qumran in Aramaic? The Aramaic scrolls that we have provide an even broader view of Danielic traditions from around this time. One of those texts, just one I want to share with you tonight, is called Pseudo-Daniel. Now, these materials feature Daniel in a role where he's disclosing a prophecy that's looking back, explaining the present and the future of Israelite history. He starts with the flood. He tells the story of the Tower of Babel. He talks about the days of exile, the toppling of empires. He prophesies about happenings in the Hellenistic period, and eventually claims that the kingdom of God is just around the corner and is coming back to rule on earth. Now, this is a new text, but it's telling a story about the same guy, this Daniel that we already knew about. Only now, again, like in those previous slides in the Greek texts, he's cast in a very different story and a very different role. Here, I think we have an opportunity. We can recontextualize the book of Daniel that we already knew about and think about the development of that book and how ancient authors, scribes, and communities were approaching it in light of this now much larger, much more lively, expansive set of traditions related to our biblical book. So in short, we have new texts again. We now have a fresh context to consider, and some of that will help us rethink some of the things we know about biblical literature. So let's move on to the second item here to talk about some of the conceptual implications of these texts for how we understand and articulate ancient Judaism. Now, this topic could also extend in many, many directions, so I just want to say a few words this evening. And what I want to talk about is how this topic of this conceptual world relates to the ways in which Jewish scribes, ancient Jewish scribes and communities thought about, interpreted, and even extended scriptural traditions that were still developing. Today, when we think about biblical interpretation, or when I assign students to do a biblical interpretation assignment or something like this, I quite often point them to go to a Bible commentary. If you go to our library or a bookstore and you open a Bible commentary, here's an example of one of Deuteronomy, you'll notice a number of things, regardless of the type of commentary or the scholar writing it. 99% of the time, you'll see that they separate the text of Scripture, here's the very beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, from what the scholar writing it thinks about that text. Those two are always separated out. They're never mingled. The Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, however, are coming from a time before the Bible. So in many cases, while the text was either not known or was still coming together. So we're in a world of scrolls. We're in a world where the scope, shape, and even the content of some biblical writings was still developing. And what this means is that scribes were creative. They were interacting with their scriptural traditions. They could interpret them as they copied them, and in some ways, even at some points, rewrite them to retell the story for a new generation. Now, this might seem like a new or an odd idea to us thousands of years later when we're dealing with a tradition and a fixed text that we already know and love. So to kind of bridge into this idea and share an example, I thought we could start with a modern analogy. Now, we probably all have songs or movies or books that we love, and then sometimes those things are remade in a new book, new song, new movie. Maybe now you've got some of these coming to mind. We live in kind of in an age of remakes, like Hollywood has run out of ideas or something, and we're getting remade originals. I feel like this is a constant conversation in our house, at least a one-way conversation, where my poor wife Tanya and our two kids will be sitting there having dinner, or we'll be at Starbucks, and a song will come on the radio, and they will have to put up with a very much impromptu discourse from me about how this song is not new. It actually came off the 1991 Nirvana album, Nevermind. And the answer that I get back is usually, well, never mind, who cares? Something like this. But I think this idea of originals, remakes, cover songs is very helpful, because the best sort of remake understands the original. It understands its timeless quality, but then it understands and tries to find creative ways of retelling it to make it meaningful again for a new generation. So in this example, a great cover of a Nirvana song even won a Grammy, which I think is far more than the band originally got for that album. But this idea of remaking a text is not all that different from remaking a book, a movie, a cover song. And I want to share just one example of that with you and see how that opens up new insight into the ancient world that we're studying. What we have here is some images of the Aramaic Genesis Apocryphon. In fact, this is the very first Aramaic text that was found at Qumran. In the first wave of discoveries in Qumran Cave 1, this was right in there. It's the text that strives for this balance of maintaining faithful fidelity to the original text of Genesis while interpreting it and retelling it for a new generation. Now, if we were to read this text, we would find it contains familiar stories. Stories of Enoch, of Lamech, of Abraham, of Sarah, of all these other figures we know from Genesis, yet it represents them. And it does so with entertaining turns and interpretive twists the whole way along. One example of this is the remake of Sarah and Abraham's sojourn into Egypt that we know from Genesis chapter 12. Now, in the biblical version, Abraham, his very first words in the book of Genesis are a lie. He lies and passes Sarah off as his sister to save his own skin. This endangers her personal safety, it risks her sexual purity, and it jeopardizes the covenantal promise for an heir via Abraham, not some lusting Egyptian pharaoh. By the end of the story, Abraham profits off this fiasco, eventually gets Sarah back, and leaves Egypt a very rich man. Not a word from Sarah. Now, if you ask me, this is kind of hardly conduct becoming of a patriarch. The writer and interpreter of Genesis Apocryphon of this text seem to have also sensed this tension and this difficulty. So he retold the story. He redrew Abraham in the process. In this new take on the classic, this classic we know of the book of Genesis, Abraham has a dream. And God tells him to just tell a slight fib to the Egyptians, so he's off the hook. Clever move. This helps them disclose their true nature of their relationship without compromising Abraham's integrity. Then God sends a pestilential spirit or an unclean spirit upon the house of Pharaoh. What does it do? Well, it combats the sexual exploitation of Sarah. It keeps the men at bay and frankly in agony so that she remains pure. Eventually, Abraham is called in to lay hands on Pharaoh and his house in prayer to exorcise this demon, to get rid of this spirit. In the end, it is this action of his prayer, laying on of hands and exorcising the demon, that secures a safe release of Sarah. Suddenly, Abraham's a hero in the remake. Now, what is this little interpreted scene in this scroll that is hardly readable in some of these images? What does that tell us about the conceptual world of ancient Judaism? I think a lot. Probably too much to talk about tonight, but maybe I can just touch on a few things that come to mind. It touches on some exciting topics, such as demonology. What were people thinking about other good or bad beings that were lurking about? It relates to ancient views of exorcism. How could you effectively get rid of these pesky little demons if you found yourself coming across one? It relates to things like postures of prayer. What bodily actions could one assume to ensure the efficacy of their prayers? And it opens up a host of questions about a number of topics, ancient reflections on gender, sexuality, purity, identity, the list goes on and on. Come to think of it, if we were to take the Genesis Apocryphon and launch a course and call it Aramaic, Demons, Sex, and Exorcisms, I think we would top the enrollments of the business school. As much as I love my colleagues there, Dr. Wood, we have something to talk about afterwards, and we'll launch this course perhaps. Many interesting topics from one little retold episode. Now, this scribal culture and conceptual world that we find some of which reflected in a text like this was not limited to Qumran or even one document. At times, the terms and topics of the Aramaic text help us really see how other ancient writings were also part of this larger shared network of ideas. Now, a moment ago, I told this retold version of Abraham laying hands on in prayer to expel this demon in the Genesis Apocryphon. Where else have you seen that before? I don't mean like this week, but I mean in a biblical text. Where have you seen that before? Anything come to mind? Okay, we have some things in Tobit where this is, again, another Aramaic text. We have this, where we have somebody exorcising demons. How about the Gospels? I think in classes at Trinity Western, at least in my classes, students are always wondering, is Jesus the answer to this question? Yes, Jesus is the answer to this question. For once, finally, he's the answer. Well, this is what we see in the Gospels. In a number of places, when Jesus shows up to face off with an evil spirit or to lay hands on, to pray for the sick, he does it using this posture. Hands on and prayer, problem solved. Now, in the context of the New Testament, this is something very new and very novel. In fact, in the context of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, when Jesus shows up and does this, it's something brand new. What the Genesis Apocryphon does for us, though, I think, is a number of things. One of which, for New Testament studies, we could say it provides our earliest known example of this approach and posture to prayer in an ancient Jewish text, 200 to 300 years before the New Testament. Now, this one small example from the Genesis Apocryphon illustrates the contribution of the Aramaic scrolls in their own right, just to understanding ancient Judaism as a whole, as well as for recovering that intellectual culture that might have implications for other ancient writings, for example, the New Testament or even the Mishnah, and how those writers interacted with the ideas of this broader common cultural heritage. But can we chase this further? We've talked about the canonical implications, we've talked about the conceptual implications, but what about the larger cultural currency? Are there ways that we can use these texts to get at something larger and even later than this ancient period that we're talking about? I think so. Now, it's easy to think that the Aramaic scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls in general, are really only relevant for understanding or recovering the earliest texts of the Hebrew Bible. For example, books like Daniel or Ezra or Tobit and other later writings. Or for their explanatory background for writings like the New Testament or the Mishnah. Yet there is more to the story. One of the things that excites me most about these texts is how they build cultural bridges. They offer the unique opportunity to explore the evolution of ideas and mobility of traditions, and how these cut through cultures, how they traverse traditional scriptural categories, how they force scholars of different fields to actually talk to each other, and how they eventually run across a diversity of demographics, communities, and generations. I want to show you just a few examples of this that will get us closer, in fact, to our own time and further away from the ancient world. The first one is of a writing that we know by the name of Aramaic Levite document. Now, this was discovered in a number of copies at Qumran in multiple caves. In Genesis, the patriarch Levi generally gets a very bad report card. While his rage at the rape of his sister Dinah in Genesis 38 seems like the justified brotherly thing to do, his father Jacob thought very differently on the matter. Now, by the end of Genesis in Genesis 49, the dying Jacob, while he's blessing his other sons, is seething in disapproval at Levi for his violent actions several chapters before in the story of Genesis 38. Like the Genesis Apocryphon, however, this text, the Aramaic Levi document, thought that there was a problem there. Levi wasn't such a bad guy. He did what he thought he was doing was right. So let's retell the story and redraw Levi in a more favorable light. So this work that we have here, fragments on both sides, presents itself as words, the veritable first-person words of Levi, who then recollects his own life and times. He has a vivid dream vision where he ascends to the heavens, and then eventually he teaches his children in things like wisdom and right living and how to worship. This writing seems to have been very popular at Qumran, not least because of the number of copies that were found there, but because Levi and his teachings here seem to be cited as authoritative for the community in one very important document called the Damascus document. Remember that one. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now, Aramaic Levi, we know about it at Qumran, but it doesn't end up in the Bible. So is it unimportant? Hardly. I think there's a bigger picture we could see here. If we look at the manuscript history of Aramaic Levi, we see there was of great interest to a number of groups and communities. It traveled northwest to Greece and was translated there or on the way, and eventually it was discovered in a codex at the Mount Athos monastery. Parts of the work also turn up in Syriac, a language very close to Aramaic, and eventually these materials were discovered in the British Library. Unfortunately, Yoda was still not there, but we do have Aramaic Levi. This other image, though, is from another collection, one that we mentioned earlier on in the night. Aramaic Levi shows up in the Cairo Geniza that we talked about, where it has a collection of ancient, antique, and medieval Jewish manuscripts. What's interesting to me about that collection and that setting is the Cairo Geniza also included one other very important text relevant to Qumran studies, the Damascus document. This document that lays out the thought, culture, and history of this insider group. So we might ask, what is the connection between these social and literary histories of these sites and the groups behind them? Frankly, I don't know. I don't think anybody does. These are the questions that we can explore, and we use these writings as our departure point. So let's think about another cultural encounter, this one relating to a writing that we know as First Enoch. Now, readers of Genesis will know Enoch, this patriarch, from Genesis 5. He's mentioned for a few short verses before he is apparently sucked up to heaven to go live with God. He is one of the only characters to evade a natural death. But this brief biblical introduction to Enoch didn't stop ancient Jewish scribes from imagining a bigger and better Enoch, where his profile eventually included things like having dream visions. He was a sage, and eventually even an intermediary between fallen angels and God above. On first glance, the Aramaic Enoch materials seem like they're too outside the box, too bizarre, too far-fetched for Protestant, Catholic, and most Orthodox collections of Scripture. Yet maybe we're not looking far enough. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition reads and reveres the writings of Enoch as Scripture, and they do so now in a language called Ge'ez, which you can see here, a manuscript in Ethiopic Ge'ez, and a fragment of Aramaic Enoch from Qumran. Here, too, we could ask a number of questions. What occasioned the journey of this Enochic tradition from Judea to the Horn of Africa? How has colonialism and canonization affected the way that we engage or in the past have simply ignored these traditions, cultures, and faith communities? Again, we have a very open question, in this case, and even a contemporary question about re-engaging marginalized groups in traditions. Finally, one of my favorite writings in the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls is a text called the Book of Giants. Again, if you remember Genesis, the early chapters in Genesis 6:4, you'll recall that there's a cryptic verse that references some wayward angels coming down, mating with human women, and birthing this breed of bloodthirsty giants. Come to think of it, if our course was something like Aramaic, demon, sex, exorcism, and giants, we could get a few more bums in seats as well. But you can see how these topics are plugging into some larger issues as we work through it. Now, as the name suggests, this book of giants develops a story from Genesis 6:4 further. It reimagines what the giants side of the equation looked like. These giants tell stories of how they grew afraid at the impending flood, how they have nightmares of their own judgment. They try to seek forgiveness from God. They even seek Enoch's advice at one point. Again, this is a book that you won't find in any biblical collection. Now, while the Book of Giants may not have registered much for Western culture, it did take hold in another location in a different form further to the east. Any guesses on how far east? If we're going east from Judea, how far do you think we could go to find Book of Giants? Oh, China. 1,000 points for whoever said China. Eventually, we have this tradition that shows up in northwestern China at a place called Turfan near Xianjing, which you can see is in the northwest here. How did it get there? It seems that this writing was of interest to a religious movement known as Manichaeanism. That, along with other pieces of Jewish and Christian literature, as well as bits of its theology, moved eastward. In fact, further east than even some of the great Western empires of antiquity. By this time, the Book of Giants was known in other versions or were translated in Middle and Late Persian dialects, some of which were used on the fringes of imperial China. Well, the Aramaic Book of Giants among the Dead Sea Scrolls is highly fragmentary. What we find at Turfan is materials that are clearly based on that shared Aramaic cluster of this tradition. At present, we know very little of the itinerary or the cultural encounters along the way. What we're starting to see is how these Aramaic texts not only relate to the canon of Scripture, or the conceptual world behind it, but the cultural worlds much further beyond. So with this, in the last few minutes, I want to return to our first big question that we started with. How do these recently discovered texts challenge, change, or confirm what we thought we knew? Some of these things, like these canonical, conceptual, and cultural implications, I'm seeing these as a way for myself and for my research team to point ahead to the types of things we're aspiring to. The why are we asking these types of questions? Yet to close our evening, I want to say a few words on the how we'll get the job done, or at least how we'll start working towards some of these destinations. First, I think it'll be very important that we undertake projects that target accessibility and uptake of our research. It shouldn't be hard to find out what we're doing or what we're thinking. Part of the reason why the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls have not registered much in academics, even in my own field in Dead Sea Scrolls studies at times, is they were published very, very late. My colleague Peter Flint published the very last volume of the official publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. A few volumes before that, we had the Aramaic Scrolls, 2009. Less than 10 years ago, these materials were published and now just started to be worked on by scholars and students. Many of them have little to no articles written on them. Most of these texts have never benefited from a graduate thesis or a doctoral dissertation, and a select few have benefited from treatments in books or commentaries and the like. Now, one of the main goals I want to have in this research unit is to develop resources for researchers across disciplines to invite them into this world of the Aramaic Scrolls and make it easy for them to bring these texts into their own research in other disciplines. Whenever possible, we'll do this with open access. It shouldn't be easy, difficult, or costly to access our findings. Second, we're going to try and develop initiatives that emphasize collaborations in research and are intentional about student training and integration. In my mind, a research chair is not something that sits isolated at a desk. Rather, it functions best when it's at a round table, and the best investment we can make in that research round table is providing seats for others, particularly emerging scholars. So for this reason, the chair and a large part of our budget will not only be dedicated to financial resources to support research at graduate, doctoral, and postdoctoral levels, it'll also integrate trainees in the entire process of research discovery and then eventually dissemination as we share our findings. In this sense, my hope is that our organization as a chair will look less like a traditional humanities chair and more like a research unit or a cluster that's perhaps more common in the social sciences or in STEM disciplines. Now, finally, the third thing on the list is I want us to be thinking about how we can use this chair to engage scholars and the public in creative ways. Through focused international and interdisciplinary events hosted on campuses like ours or around the world, as well as mobilized online, through interactions with the global public on social media, and sharing our work in more popular level publications, my hope for the chair is that our discoveries not only have implications for scholars, but also open new questions about ancient texts for the wider public. One example of this is our very first event, a summer conference that we hosted, co-sponsored by Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich with Professor Lauren Stuckenbrook. We collaborated on an event over the summer, and our event explored the concept of the four kingdoms in the book of Daniel. Only we didn't leave it at the book of Daniel. Rather, we invited scholars from all over the world, from Canada, from abroad, as well as some Trinity Western alumni to speak and engage on this theme in Daniel, and then chase it through a number of time periods, literatures, cultures, traditions, and even artistic and architectural representations. In the end, this will result in a volume in the coming year with Brill Publishers, as well as a fully open access series of web lectures that will be available through the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. Another example of this type of thinking is two magazine articles that relate to some of my current research in Biblical Archaeological Review and Didacticos. Now, these articles are based in research, hours in the library, but honestly, they were written for you. One thing I think is very important for us as scholars is to not always be talking to each other, but to be talking to some real-life people. I think you're very interesting and amazing for the fact that you're here tonight, and I think we need to do a better job of that in the future. If our books and articles only end up in specialized academic libraries, frankly, we haven't done our job. On the way out this evening, we've made copies of off-prints of two of these articles. Please take that as a takeaway, as a gift to you to further your education in the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, or on our house, use them for coloring sheets or whatever you need. But they're there for the taking, and please take that not lightly. That's a gesture of us trying to say we want to invite you into this conversation to share our work. Now, in 30 minutes or so, that's an outline of the ideas that are driving this Canada Research Chair in religious identities of ancient Judaism, as well as a way that we're trying to look ahead to some of the waypoints we've charted for our research group in the next 5 years, and hopefully the next 5 years after that. I have to say it's truly an honor to continue the heritage of Dead Sea Scrolls research on campus here at Trinity Western, as well as now the heritage we have of Canada Research Chair's appointments. It's also exciting to do so with a new set of texts to build on a foundation that was built by some of my own teachers and scholars here. So again, thank you to all of you for joining me this evening. And of course, thanks I will give in advance now to our wonderful respondents, my colleagues from down the highway in Vancouver, Dr. Sarah Milstein from UBC and Dr. Paul Spilsbury from Regent. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I look forward to your words in a few moments. Thank you very much.